Okay, the floor is open. Steve Charnovitz, and then please go to the mic or use the traveling mic, and introduce.
Steve Charnovitz, GW Law School. Ambassador Schwab, let me just say at the outset, I commend your leadership at USTR, and I support the Columbia FTA, and I deplore what the House of Representatives did. But I would question your narrative. It seems a bit one-sided. It's true what the House did is unprecedented, but it wasn't also unprecedented to have a situation where the Congress, the majority in the House, was sending a very clear signal not to send this trade agreement up. And yet the administration did it, I would argue somewhat recklessly. So here's my question. Given what Dr. Berkston said about the gaping hole we now have in U.S. trade policy and U.S. foreign policy, and the ramifications for what happened on April 10th, was it the right choice for the administration to send that agreement up in face of those signals? Would you do it again? Do you think it was a mistake? And secondly, what lessons have you learned from this episode that you could put in place for a decision as to whether to send the Korea free trade agreement up this year?
Let me begin by disagreeing with your underlying premise. The thing that was unprecedented here, and we're going back to the origins of Trade Promotion Authority, 1974, there has never been an instance where a Congress refused to take up or refused to accept an agreement, a trade agreement sent forward. So what was unprecedented was, and in fact, one could argue, and I would argue, that the rupture in TPA, the rupture in fast track, took place when the Congress of the United States said, when the Democratic congressional leadership said, don't send the bill, over and over and over again. And face it, this agreement was reached 18 months before it was sent up. 2, the text of this agreement was identical to the Peru agreement. Take out the word Peru, put in the word Colombia. So it's not as though it was a piece of legislation that no one had seen before. It had gone through a hearing process and a markup process, so it was not a new piece of legislation. So I would argue the President had no choice, and were we to repeat this, the President would still have no choice. And in this particular case, I cannot begin to tell you how many personal communications took place with the House Democratic leadership saying, okay, we'll do this, and then it'll work. Do that, and then do that. And we kept moving, and we kept delivering every step of the way. And if you take the date where Congress is expected to adjourn in September, and you go back, you count back 90 legislative days, you get to the 8th of April. It was the last possible day that the President could send up the legislation. And it was very evident from all of the history that had we not sent it up, there would have been no legislation, no trade legislation. That is what is unprecedented. At that point, there is no Trade Promotion Authority. There just is no Trade Promotion Authority. And so these agreements were negotiated in good faith, with full consultations, fully compliant with the provisions of TPA. The administration did everything and then some it is required to do. And the Congress has not even held a hearing, let alone a mock markup or moved ahead with the legislation. So I'm not sure that there is, I can't imagine that there was any other scenario under those circumstances, because the May 10 deal was to lay out the path for all 4 agreements, each one on a separate path. And in the case of the Colombia deal, the only additional prerequisite imposed by the Congressional Democratic leadership, which was on June 29, was the evidence of a decline in violence and impunity. And that evidence, and I can read you chapter and verse, but that, well, you know, you've obviously got a strong labor background. You know how dramatic the reduction in violence has been in Colombia.
Just for the record, on Steve's second question, you're saying that even if all of the Colombia problems could be cleaned up, it's now too late for either Panama or South Korea to have a forced vote, even if the TPA time deadlines were still in effect.
That is correct. I mean, one could still force the issue. One could still force the issue, but Congress could run the clock if they didn't unplug the clock. I mean, but the point is, TPA, the violation of TPA took place with the refusal to set a date. And all we were asking for was a date. We needed a date certain for action. And we were just led on.
I wish they would have accelerated their adjournment date instead of doing what they did. Susan.
Susan Aronson, GWU. Thank you for your remarks. I want to focus our attention to the general public. And, you know, you've posited this as a sort of dialectic between those who want trade to advance and those who don't. And the President talks about in terms of job, liberty, free and fair trade. And I would argue these terms are really unhelpful. And I would like to ask you to try your best to encourage the President and other senior government officials to talk about trade agreements as what they really are, which are agreements to regulate global trade relations, right? But using that key word, regulation. USTR, a while back, published something called A Preface to Trade, which was all about trade agreements and what they do. And I would urge you, so forgive me for sort of doing a lecture here, which I think is disrespectful and inappropriate, but out of my support for freer trade, I urge this upon you and other advocates. As Fred pointed out, trade today is more about food safety, environment, labor rights, as well as tariffs, right? It's about domestic policies, and that's the turf of Congress. The public needs to understand how they, as taxpayers, investors, citizens, as well as producers and consumers, are affected by these. But no one ever talks about it that way. So if you want to change congressional attitudes, to some extent, you have to reach out to the public. And one way to do that is to change how proponents of trade talk about it. What do you think?
We can have a discussion about nomenclature and what words pull better than others. I think where you and I would agree is that it is worth taking the time and the energy for policymakers, leaders, including members of Congress, to explain why trade agreements are in our national self-interest. And I think the real problem is that politicians have sort of run and hide from the criticisms about NAFTA rather than saying, excuse me, this has been good for our economy. And this has been good for our foreign policy. And laying out the facts that trade can be a positive-sum game rather than this notion that somehow if I'm winning, you're losing. And I think there are ways of better expressing it than others. I'm sure that's right. But I think the first thing is that for policymakers and leaders and elected representatives, as well as those of us in the executive branch, to step up and give the American people credit for being able to listen, rather than those who go out there and demagogue and continue to prey on anxieties and fears and imply somehow that trade is the cause of our economic ills and anxieties, which is not the case, and implies that they're easy trade fixes, which there aren't. Anyway, so I'm sort of agreeing and passing on the nomenclature.
Okay, Howard, we've got a lot of people waiting in line. Howard.
Howard Rosen here at the Institute. As Fred said in his introduction, you were instrumental in 1974 in drafting that legislation. I have no doubt of your support for trade adjustment assistance. Having said that, I am saddened by the fact that in your effort to lament the partisanship of trade, I think you've really mischaracterized the last 2 years of discussion on trade adjustment assistance. Number one, TAA was in the, and more than TAA, the whole domestic adjustment was in the May 10th agreement. It was not kind of a side thing. The administration did absolutely nothing from May 10th when that agreement was signed. It's questionable if you can say they've even done anything yet, number one. Number two, the House voted on a bill, so there is a House bill. The administration's Department of Labor refused to participate in the discussions on that bill, and it passed the House. And the administration pulled out of negotiations with the Senate 2 weeks ago that were going and that were very constructive. Why did the administration pull out of those negotiations?
Howard, just a couple of points of fact. One, Those conversations in the Senate are still going on, to my knowledge. Two, the House, our understanding in the May 10 agreement was that we would work together on trade adjustment assistance into the summer and the fall. That was the understanding.
Of last year.
Of last year, exactly. And then all of a sudden, the Ways and Means Committee and the House leadership turned around and moved TAA without so much of a hearing, without consultations. Never mind the Department of Labor not being consulted. There were a couple of junior-level Department of Labor people who were asked to look at the facts. There was never any consultation with the executive branch because, quite frankly, we were waiting to work with them on TAA, and they moved it within a matter of 2 weeks. So I don't know what your sources are, but my sources tell me quite differently. Take us to today. Today, we have been asking for months for an empowered interlocutor on the House side. Months.
Fred, can I respond? I don't know. I don't want to monopolize, but I'm sorry, Sue. But it troubles me that you are not being given the appropriate information. On May, I testified at that hearing. If you think that the Assistant Secretary of Employment and Training is a low-level Department of Labor official, I don't know how to respond to that. The Labor Department, the administration, has never put forward a proposal. All they have done, and this is despite the fact that the President, for the first time in 40 years, mentions TAA in the State of the Union address. You can't have it better.
Which was not an accident.
I understand. You can't have it better, but his rhetoric has not translated down into action. And I just want to make sure that you know this, if people haven't told you this. The negotiations in the Senate stopped when the House voted to remove the time constraint. And it stopped not because the Democrats walked out. So right now, Ambassador Schwab, I'm sorry, right now they are not taking place.
And could I add just a substantive question? Because as far as I understand it, the administration has still never accepted what seems to be the most obvious point of compromise in moving toward a new bill, namely to extend the coverage of TAA to the services sector. As far as I know, the administration has still not accepted that rather simple and cardinal element of any reform.
As far as you know, the administration is not negotiating with Fred Bergsten.
Fine, I'm happy to.
No, I mean the point is, Howard, the President has been talking about trade adjustment assistance for more than 2 years. It was in the American Competitiveness Initiative. It was in the State of the Union.
It's great.
It was in the State of the Union. We have asked to engage. But quite frankly, it takes two to tango.
I don't understand. You're the administration. What do you mean, asked to engage? Put out a proposal.
Okay, on to the next. We'll come back, I'm sure. Next question.
Chin-Suk Lee of NBC Television Korea. My question is about the recent beef deal that the United States struck with South Korea. According to the deal, South Korea has to open its market almost fully, almost 100% to U.S. beef. According to the deal, the Korean government should import, well, not exactly should import, but it has to open its market to all kinds of U.S. beef, bone-in, bone-out, of all ages. And also, even when a BSE case occurs in the United States, the South Korean government cannot ask for the stopping of importation of the U.S. beef. And because of these articles, because of these issues, a lot of millions of South Koreans are angry about the deal. And when the deal was struck in April, the two governments were happy that, expecting that this deal will open the way to successful Korea-U.S. FTA agreement, but actually it hurts rather than strengthening the U.S.-Korea alliance. Is there any room that the two governments readjust some of the terms or some of the articles in the deal? And I heard that before you came over here, you had a meeting with the president. Did you talk about this issue, and did you talk about how to solve this U.S.-Korea beef deal? Thank you.
I'm very, very pleased you asked this question because, as you probably know, one of the big problems in Korea today has been very inaccurate and extremely untrue and sensationalized media, press coverage of the beef deal. So I'm glad you asked the question, and I trust that when you go back with your report, it will be straightforward and it will be honest and it will not exaggerate, because there have been some very, very poor press reports in Korea. Because this trade agreement, this agreement on beef is simply Korea accepting science-based international standards. These aren't U.S. standards. These are international standards by the OIE, which is the international body of scientists that assess what is safe and what is not. And the beef that American producers will be selling in Korea is the same beef that everyone in this room probably ate for lunch. It's the beef that we eat ourselves. It's the beef that we feed our children. It is perfectly safe. It is safe for Korean consumers. It is science-based, and the issue has to do not with BSE, but with the treatment of the animals, the carcasses. And as long as SRMs, specified risk materials, are removed, and that's what the protocol agreed between the two governments, the protocol between the two governments ensures the safety and the health of American beef that will be made available to Korean consumers. And Korea has, within that agreement, within that protocol, many rights to audit packing plants, to audit slaughterhouses, to audit the processes here. So it's a very strong agreement. The Korean government of South Korea was extremely tough in terms of imposing standards, but recognized that the key is science-based standards to maintain the health and safety of Korean citizens.
Thank you for your answer. But the Koreans think that it's not fair because the U.S. beef, the beef that you consume in the United States, is 90% of the beef that you consume in the United States is less than 20 months old, while the beef that you're going to... That's not true?
No, that's not true. The beef that will be made available to Korean consumers is exactly the same as the beef we consume in the United States.
What about
exactly the same.
What about my second point? Even when a BSE case occurs, breaks out in the United States tomorrow, or after the deal goes into effect on May 15th, does the Korean government, will the Korean government have the right to ask for stopping of importation from the
point that the Korean government and Korean consumers need to be concerned about is the beef, is the carcass prepared in such a way that removes any risk? Whether or not there is a BSE cow is less relevant than making sure that every single carcass is prepared in a way that takes away any risk. And that's what the protocol is about, removing these SRMs. And therefore, that is the protection, plus, obviously, the ability to audit the system, the ability to inspect. There are many rights that the Korean government built into the protocol that involve proportionate responses, that involve sampling of boxes, that involve additional inspections and audits of plants where there might be a problem. So there are a lot of protections in there. The issue, though, has to do with how the process of preparation occurs to make sure that any risk material is removed regardless of the age of the carcass.
Okay, I think she's answered this one, but just one more on that. But the broader point, and she raised that, is that the Koreans thought that by opening up on beef, they were opening the door to U.S. agreement to the FTA.
Which is...
So what can you say to try to assure them on that?
Sure. No, this is, I think, and the answer is it has certainly had the intended effect. I have been frustrated for almost a year about my inability to have a conversation on Capitol Hill with members of Congress, a serious conversation about the Chorus FTA, because it is such a strong free trade agreement, both for the United States and for South Korea. And the beef issue, as long as it was out there, and as long as Korea was not following internationally accepted standards, the beef issue hampered our ability to even, to be taken seriously when we went to Capitol Hill to talk about the agreement. We have now, since the protocol was announced, we have started to have members of Congress taking this much more seriously. The business community, including the agricultural community, has been up on Capitol Hill talking to members of Congress about the benefits. We have a lot going on now that was not occurring to start building some momentum for this free trade agreement. So I think it was absolutely the right thing to do, both for Korean consumers, but also for Korean industries and workers, as well as obviously U.S. Agricultural, U.S. farmers and manufacturers and workers who want this free trade agreement to go through.
Okay, next question.
Ulrico Reale, I'm a local lawyer. My question is about GSP, Ambassador. My question is whether the administration favors the extension and whether you think that the Congress will extend it.
Yes and yes.
Thank you very much.
Very good. Next question.
Madam Ambassador, now that you're having these Eric Wasson, Inside U.S. Trade, now that you're having serious conversations on the Hill, do those conversations include talking with members or staff on the Ways and Means and Finance Committee about ways to address their auto concerns? And would that include a possible compromise, a May 10th-like agreement that doesn't involve reopening the FTA? And just to address the second question is Mr. Bergsten's point about Doha. You said the dynamic is different on multilateral, but how is the April 10th decision affecting Doha? You're proceeding in Geneva full bore to get an agreement, but is it now coming up against this sort of skepticism that he mentioned on the part of trading partners that perhaps without TPA it will never get approved? Thanks.
Let me answer the first. Let me answer the first question. I guess I'll do the first question first. On the Chorus FTA, and you've heard me say this, we believe that this agreement really stands on its own on the merits, and that includes the auto provision. One of the positive benefits of the beef issue being resolved is that this agreement is now going to get a hearing, and I don't mean a formal hearing because I went through that discussion already, but a hearing and at some point a formal hearing on the merits, so that we're in a position to make the case and explain why the auto provision is as strong as it is. We're faced with a circumstance where Korea has been very protectionist in terms of auto imports. 8% tariff, discriminatory non-tariff barriers under the Chorus and at the same time, in the counterpoint, we have a tariff of 2.5% that keeps out nothing. So what you have with the free trade agreement is the elimination of both the tariffs on both sides, and the discriminatory elements of the non-tariff barriers on the Korean side. And because we knew there was a history of some skepticism here, shall we say, we added in an unprecedented accelerated dispute resolution mechanism and snapback. And so I think that provision really does stand on its own. And as you know, the auto industry in the United States is split over the Chorus FTA. But I'm looking forward to being able to make that case. On the Doha question, I think honestly the biggest challenge facing the Doha negotiations is, as I said, whether the emerging markets, the advanced developing countries, are going to be willing to open their markets commensurate with their levels of development, with their levels of economic growth. And I say this because, again, Doha is a negotiation for the year 2015 and 2020 and 2025. Clearly, developed countries need to do more than developing countries. But for the bulk of developing countries, they will stand the most to gain from China and India and Brazil opening their markets, both to each other and to smaller developing countries.
Given the description you just gave us about the difficulties with the Congress, how realistic is this goal? And what's being done, obviously?
We as an administration have been working assiduously, working very hard in the WTO with our Russian counterparts to help Russia move through the very complicated process of WTO accession. And significant progress has been made. Russia is not there yet, and there are, you and I have talked about this, there are things that Russia needs to do to get to that point, but we are narrowing those down to the manageable few. And I believe, and we are, cautiously optimistic that we will be able to see this process completed this year. This is more, as you know, more of a foreign policy than a trade policy issue per se. But we will, when the time comes, when Russia has, completed its accession commitments, look forward to working on Capitol Hill to go through those developments with interested members of Congress.
Is there time
Susan,
left?
okay, I think we're going to have to cut it. Susan, thank you very much for your candor. Let me invite everybody to stay if you want. We've got refreshments in the back. Join us out on the patio for the nice spring weather. Good luck, and we hope you succeed in all these various difficult tasks. Thank you very much.